Yo, Shortbox Nation, this is Botter, and I'm here to tell you right now that con season starts early this year with the return of Northeast Florida's premier anime, comic book, and sci-fi event, Collective Con. That's right, Northeast Florida's largest pop culture convention returns for its 10th year on March 8th through the 10th at the Prime Osborne Center in Jacksonville, Florida. 10 years of Collective Con, they're pulling all the stops out to make sure this is a can't-miss event. And the guest list they got going, don't even get me started on the guest list. I mean, they've got A-list celebrity guests and voice actors from some of your favorite movies, anime, and video games like Elijah Wood and Sean Ashton, Ray Park, Trisha Helfer, Ross Marquand, Max Middleman, and Bo-Katan herself will be there, Katie Sackhoff. Tell me what other convention is giving you the opportunity to meet Frodo and Sam from Lord of the Rings, Darth Maul, and One Punch Man all under the same roof. Only at Collective Con. And if you're looking to get some of your favorite comics signed, or if you want to get an original sketch from some of the best comic artists in the world, well, you're in luck, because there'll be plenty of comic and creator guests there, like DC comic artist extraordinaire Clay Mann, Harvey Award-nominated illustrator John Taylor Christopher, Marvel and DC cover artist Chris Stevens, and acclaimed Star Wars author Timothy Zahn. They'll all be at Collective Con this year. And if you're looking to bring the family, or if you want to make a weekend out of it, you're in luck, because there'll be so much going on at Collective Con that weekend in the form of vendors, fan panels, video game tournaments, cosplay contests, after parties, and a bunch of fan events. You can purchase single and 3-day weekend passes now using the link in this episode's show notes, or by going to collectivecon.com to book your tickets and hotel. Buy your tickets now, and I'll see you at Collective Con, March 8th through the 10th. Now let's start the show. Shortbox Nation, welcome back to the podcast. How are we doing today? And I hope the answer is feeling good, feeling great, and ready for another Shortbox episode. To all of our new friends joining us for the first time, my name is Botter. Welcome to the Shortbox Podcast, the comic review and talk show where we provide you with the best conversations and interviews about comics, culture, and more. Today, it is my honor to present you with a special bonus episode. The audio you're about to hear is my in-person interview with Eisner Award-winning comic creator Jim Rugg, who is no stranger to the podcast, as all of you should know by now. He was on the show back in March when he was doing his press run for Hulk Grand Design. But this conversation is special because it was recorded live at the Duval Comic and Zine Fest, which took place over the weekend here in my hometown of Jacksonville, Florida. More specifically, my backyard at the downtown Jax Public Library, which is like a 5-minute walk from me, which is great on my gas mileage. I mean, it was a win-win. Now, you heard us talking about the Duval Comic and Zine Fest the last few episodes and how it was going to be a big deal because it was the first of its kind. It was going to be awesome. It was going to be a whole day celebrating, self-publishing and independent comic creators. And we were trying to get the word out. Well, I'm glad to report it blew all of my expectations out the water. Jax showed up. The Shortbox Nation showed up in full force. We got to make so many new friends, and I bought so many comics and zines from some awesome independent creators. I'll post my haul on Instagram so you can check that out there. So shout out to the Duval Comic and Zine Fest Committee and the Jax Public Library for throwing such an amazing event. I hope those of you that couldn't attend or just live out of state, maybe you're one of our international Shortbox listeners, hopefully you feel a little bit of that magic here in this episode. And I hope you come back next week when Ed and Ashley join me for a Black Panther dedicated episode. Our Patreon subscribers are very hard at work voting on the next spotlight topic. They're over there having like a congressional hearing about what we're going to talk about next. So if you want in on that, or if you want more episodes and bonus content to enjoy, join our Patreon community. What's taking you so long? Right? There's nothing to think about. It's a great deal for a lot of extra perks and content. Use your favorite scrolling thumb. Mine happens to be my right. That's what I scroll with. And smush the link in these show notes and make your way over there, right? Join our Patreon community. That's all I got to share with you today. So I'm going to go ahead and sign out so this episode can finally start. And I'll catch you around next week, all right? Peace.
Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Shortbox Podcast.
The Shortbox Podcast is recorded live from Jacksonville, Florida.
Duval Comic and Zine Fest. How are we doing today? I appreciate the response. I even commend the effort. And in all honesty, that type of energy would work at any other comic book show or event, but not the case here. And I know that we're just getting to know each other, but I've got a small favor to ask, all right? There's some very important people here that can ensure that more events like this happen in the future. And I think it's safe to say we all want that, right? Well, I want you guys to keep that in mind when I ask that one more time, all right? If that was 100%, I want 120. Duval Comic and Zine Fest, how are we doing today? And that's the kind of energy that we need for today's event, all right? Because we are at the inaugural Duval Comic and Zine Fest, the first of its kind. Something that the team here at the Jacksonville Public Library and the DCAZ committee have worked, really long hours to get off the ground and make happen. Some very important people that you should thank personally, should you run into them, for bringing us all together are folks like James Green, Lindsay Anderson, Tony Ayubi, and Dan Whaley. Let's go ahead and give them a dedicated round of applause, too. There we go. They deserve it. They deserve that. For those of you that don't know, this event was actually 2 years in the making. They originally wanted to have this happen back in March 2020. But as we all know, we were all living in a very different society in 2020. But thankfully, hardships and uncertainty eventually gave out to dedication and persistence. And that's why we're here. We're celebrating the spirit of self-publishing and supporting some of the best zine and comic creators in the entire state of Florida. I think you guys are, chose a really good day and a really good way to spend your Saturday. So I personally, and on behalf of the Jacksonville Public Library, want to thank you guys for taking the time out of your weekend for attending this event, but also taking, a few minutes out of, enjoying all the great comics and zines to attend today's Lit Chat. I know I really appreciate it, and I'm sure on behalf of the staff, they appreciate it as well. And with all of that out the way, we can now officially start today's Lit Chat interview. Your esteemed guest is an Eisner and Ignatz award-winning comic creator hailing from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's right, he flew all the way down here to see all you lovely people. His resume includes highly raved about creator-owned projects like Street Angel, The Plain Janes, and Octobriana 1976, as well as books for Dark Horse and Marvel Comics. He's also one half of the extremely popular comic book YouTube channel, Cartoonist Kayfabe. The list could go on, and I could just be up here reading his accolades. But the point is that you could not find a better guest, a better author to attend an event meant to celebrate self-publishing and zine culture. Duval Comic and Zine Fest 2022. Let's give a warm and very loud welcome to our special guest, Jim Rugg. How you like that?
That's a great intro. Hope I live up to it.
Jim, is this your first time in Jax?
It is, yes.
And how are you liking Jax so far? How are you liking the event so far?
I love the event. I love these library events. I was at CXC in Columbus at the beginning of this month. Another beautiful library. I often joke, kids have it so good these days because when I was a kid, I had a wonderful library, but very few comics in the library. So to be at a comics event like this and a library like this, it overwhelms me. I love it.
Yeah, I think it's something I can personally say I think I take for granted, being I live so close and just all the great options, especially like how involved, people like James and the whole DCAZ committee are with the community. Fun fact, I don't know if you've been told this, but this library has the largest collection of zines and comics in the Southeast. I think it's like the first of its kind in the entire Southeastern United States. And over there in the maker space, you've probably seen it, like thousands of zines.
It's amazing. We actually have a nice zine collection in the local Pittsburgh library back home. And I know we're going to talk about zines some today, and that was one of the places that I first was exposed to them through my library. So seeing a zine collection in a library, just like comics and graphic novels, kind of warms my heart.
That's good stuff. And I guess on the topic of like where you're from in Pittsburgh and whatnot, what is the self-publishing and what is the comic scene like in Pittsburgh?
Man, this might be the only question we get to. It's a great scene. Pittsburgh's a relatively small city, but I have friends. Most of my friends are involved in comics in some way or another. And a friend was visiting recently, and we were going to comic shops to kind of dig for comics as we do. And naming comic shops that were local to Pittsburgh, I stopped around number 20, which is a huge number for a relatively small city. And that history of comics goes back into the 70s. We have multiple retailers that were selling comics all the way back in the 70s. And I think it really, that's how we would grow new fans or new creators, because we had these resources. When I was interested in comics, I found a couple of these stores, and that's who was like showing me, oh, you like this artist? Check out this book, or have you seen this book? And it really was my informal education on comics. So the comic scene there is really good. I wasn't the only young fan who wanted to make comics, of course, there. And they participated in the same system I did, where they were going to comic shops and they were basically learning from the great comic shop owners there. And I have hooked up with many of them. When I started making comics, you kind of find your people, your other people that are making them. And we would get together once a week and bring our comic pages or our mini comics and basically try to get better. It was a captive audience, so to speak. When you're starting out, it can be hard to find somebody to read your comics, and maybe rightfully so. It's pretty rough in the beginning. But some of the other people there are Ed Piskor, who I do Cartoonist Kayfabe with, and I've known from his 20 years. We travel to comic book conventions together. We used to meet every week to talk comics. I guess we still meet every week to talk comics. Tom Scioli is another creator there that did a grand design for Fantastic Four, did Godland for Image Comics, has done a ton of books, did a Jack Kirby biography recently that's very highly acclaimed. Frank Santoro is another cartoonist based in Pittsburgh. And having other peers around is invaluable. I've heard that in some of the other panels today, talking about the value of having other comic fans or comic makers around. And that's one of the values of an event like this, is where we can find each other. We can find other people who are interested in comics and talking comics, making comics, and all of that. So we have a very healthy comic scene in Pittsburgh with a nice history there.
And I know you do a lot of, I'd seen you and Ed at Heroes Con in Charlotte, North Carolina earlier over the summer. I know that you kind of get around when it comes to hitting up the different comic conventions. And I think what I noticed there, and I see here too, is that you do a really good job of hitting like the artist alleys and doing, seeking out, just emerging talent or just like really cool stuff. And I was curious, when you're looking at, at a convention like this, like what are the things that pop out to you, or how do you go about navigating looking for new artists and whatnot?
It gets harder and harder because the quality of work has really improved steadily as long as I've been a fan and been making comics. So, good design, maybe, something that pops out. Like I often say different for me is better than good, because I've been reading comics for virtually my whole life and really looking at them with the eye of what can I learn from this comic? What does it do well that I can steal or borrow? And as a result, everything that I read is compared to that history, So if you want to do a superhero comic, I read Watchmen within the first 2 years of reading comics. So that's kind of where the bar is set, and it goes up with more experience and more reading. So when I'm walking around, it's just whatever catches my eye, really. That's the nice thing with comics is they're visual. So you can quickly be drawn in, pulled in as you're walking by these tables. And that's the first thing that, catches my eye is, does something pop? Does something grab my attention? Does it make me want to, go in and see what's inside that cover?
Can you recall maybe a recent artist or comic that you recently kind of came across that really grabbed your attention? Yo, this is Botter. Sorry for interrupting this episode, but I'll keep it brief. I wanted to let you know about a massive sale we have going on over at the Shortbox store on all of our merchandise and apparel. That's theshortboxstore.bigcartel.com. You can now save 20% off your entire order using the discount code YOO, Y-O-O. So if you've been waiting for the right time to finally buy that gauntlet snapback, or if you ever wanted to buy any of the shirts you see me wear on the podcast, well, now's your chance to get them for a steal. We still have a few sizes left of everything, but they won't last long, and once they're gone, they are gone. And that I mentioned that all of our apparel is screen printed on high quality material. None of that heat transfer or direct to garment stuff. Our shirts are some of the most comfortable ones you'll ever wear, and the hats look even better in person. So wear your support for the Shortbox Nation proudly, knowing that you're going to look damn good doing it. Get to theshortboxstore.bigcartel.com as soon as you can, and don't forget to use that discount code YOO, Y-O-O, to save 20% off your entire order. All of this information can be found in this episode's show notes if you want to get there faster. Thanks for not pressing fast forward. Now back to the show.
Oh, man. These are often my hardest questions. But I do remember one recently. We also get a lot of comics sent to us in the mail as part of Cartoonist Kayfabe. And one of the comics that I pulled out was called Acid Nun. And it was from a cartoonist and a painter out of Chicago. And it had that quality as like halfway out of the envelope. It looked spectacular. It was super bright colors. So like the colors quickly grabbed my attention. And it never really let go. And I liked it so much, I started following the artist. I got one of her paintings. I eventually did a pinup for, there's now a book collection of Acid Nun. So that one really blew me away. And I don't think it was her first comic, but she was primarily a painter and hadn't done too many comics, I don't think. So this one really stood out. And, you know, it was the visuals, definitely, is what was the first part. And then if they're good enough, you start reading and you kind of go down that rabbit hole of a good story.
To get a pinup from Jim Rugg, you know, and I just kind of blind mail away. That's an awesome story. So I wanted to get back on the topic of zines, because it's an interesting, you know, medium for me as someone that's like always been very heavy into like mainstream comics. I honestly didn't come across, you know, like zine culture until a few years ago when I had someone like James Green and Lindsay Anderson on the show, and they kind of like showed me the ways of zine and opened my eyes to that. And what I still find fascinating to this day is just how ingrained zine culture is. Like longevity wise, right? Like it is deeply rooted in American society, but also pop culture. You know, like there's some people that trace zines back to like the 1700s. Like Benjamin Franklin had like a pamphlet he was handing out. And some consider that like among the first zines. But then, you know, you think about like the prominent zine culture with, you know, early science fiction, media zines of Star Trek and things like Starsky and Hutch zine, the fan zines. And then, of course, like the 70s and 80s with the whole punk scene. I think I say all of that to say that regardless of the time period that you look at, zines have just been around for so long. And the one thing that's for certain is that they have such close ties with like underground movements and communities, and serving as like an outlet for self-expression, especially to like under marginalized like groups and people that have had no other options or ways to self-express. And that is my long-winded way of you know, turning the tables back to you and asking, in your words and, you know, experience at that, how do zines and the culture behind them stand out from like other print media, like magazines and specifically like comic books?
Ooh, magazines, they stand out because zines I often associate as the work of one person or of a very specific interest. And they're not encumbered by advertising or the need to have a certain number of circulation or sales, which allows you to be very specific to whatever your concerns are, whatever your interests are. You know, comics, I think there's some crossover with comics in that traditionally, a lot of people, when you say comics, you think maybe of like like Spider-Man or Batman. And those books are typically done by a team of creators, as opposed to, again, a zine or a mini comic that is often the work of one person or a very small group of people that share some kind of common interest, common goal. And so I think that's the big difference, is that individual voice and the individual interests. And, you know, one of my favorite things about comics is this idea that because it's words and pictures and one person can create that, it's about as close as you can get from like somebody's ideas, you know, being in their head to like put that information in my head. Let me see the world through your eyes. And that's what I think zines offer, whether it's mini comics or zines or self-publishing. It's that idea of like, I can really transfer some information, some ideas, some point of view that I have to somebody that picks this up. And the nice thing with, you know, where we are in terms of technology is you could make one copy of the thing and it's still cost effective. You know, it's I have a friend who calls it a low barrier to entry. And part of that low barrier is it doesn't cost a lot of money to make a zine or to self-publish a comic today. And that allows, again, a tremendous amount of creative freedom. So if you have some weird idea that you can't sell or get past a gatekeeper, an editor, or a publisher, zines offer you a way to at least put that idea out there and communicate that with someone else. And I think that's always been my attraction to them. It's a very personal medium.
Well said. I came across maybe the most like niche zine I've ever seen, and it's over there at Leslie's table. It is a zine about the character Barrett from Final Fantasy. I think it was like 20, 30 page zine all about this character. That is awesome. What? Like for hyper fans to be like, I've got an outlet and I'm going to tell you all about, there we go, right here. Thank you. Bulletproof Heart. And there's this really good quote from a writer at Folio Weekly by the name of Rain Henderson. They wrote a really good piece about today's event. And I like this quote here. They wrote, "Zines offer a tangible glimpse at society, pushing through the clutter of likes and shares by ways of hands, not thumbs." I think that kind of encapsulates a lot of what you just said. But on the topic of zine history and comic books and that correlation, I think even the most hardcore, comic book superhero fan may overlook that some of the most popular and, biggest name, most popular characters and properties in comic books originated with zine and self-publishing. And the two that primarily come to mind, and I use that as examples, is Superman and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Superman was started out, in name only, of course, as a sci-fi zine by the same people who would go on to create them, Siegel and Schuster. And TMNT, of course, Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, self-published, drawn by hand, distributed by hand. So, that spirit of DIY and self-publishing, it even touches like, the biggest properties in comic books. And Jim, I was curious, what are some examples of your favorite self-published comics or independent creators? Like what names come to mind?
Well, you stole my thunder a little bit with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They're very legendary. I was reading comics in the late 80s and early 90s, and my dream at that point was to draw Spider-Man or Wolverine or Hulk. And at that point, my favorite, I was following artists around. And at that point, comics were very popular, and these artists were selling millions of copies of things like X-Men and Spider-Man. And they decided that they wanted more control over that. And so they quit Marvel and DC, and they went off and created their own comic book characters that they would own and they would control and they would self-publish. And that became Image Comics. And so my dream changed from wanting to draw Wolverine or Spider-Man to wanting to create my own characters and draw them. And one of the examples at that time was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That was the previous generation that showed how valuable owning your own creations was. And it inspired, generations ever since. Around that time in the early 90s, another big self-publishing success was Jeff Smith's Bone, which I'm sure you can find copies of in the library. It's a wonderful all ages epic. And he self-published that throughout the 90s. Now Scholastic publishes some of it, but he retained ownership. And that was the takeaway for me as a creator. And there are really a pretty rich history of that kind of, if not just self-publishing, at least creator ownership in comics. And as a kid growing up and trying to learn about this, I would just follow whatever creators were talking about it, to try to understand that there was an alternative where you could have control of this stuff that you make. You could control it your whole life. You could benefit from it and exploit it however you wanted to, or not exploit it, but it would be up to you. And so, those are some of the big ones. Walking Dead is one of those titles. That creator, Robert Kirkman, ultimately bought a stake in Image Comics. So now he is self-publishing Walking Dead, so one of the big successes to come out of that movement of creator ownership.
Robert Kirkman is a big dog at Image Comics now, which is really awesome to see. And, to give credit where credit is due, a lot of the creator-owned titles that people have come to know you for, I think I saw one of your Super Mag books floating around here, but Street Angel, Aphrodisiac, Octobriana have all started out or have been released in some form or fashion as a zine. I think you document your creative process in zine format. Does your overall approach to or creative process change depending if you're approaching a traditional kind of comic book or a zine? Like, how does it differ?
Yeah, I usually, whenever I sit down to start a project, I have some idea for a story or a character or something that I want to do. Format is one of the first things I think about. And if I'm self-publishing it, that changes maybe some of the options that I have, the size of the project, the cost of the project, all of these things, they come into play right in the very beginning. So they inform almost every creative decision that I make. And, Octobriana in 1976, you mentioned, it's the world's first blacklight comic. I kind of co-published that with Ad House Books, there you go, a publisher that I've worked with a lot, including Aphrodisiac and Street Angel, but I still retained ownership of the characters. But it was a matter of figuring out, can we print something with fluorescent ink in order to create a blacklight comic effect? And, that's the same to me as making a zine. It's figuring out exactly how you want to produce this thing. So in addition to a character that although I don't own Octobriana, she's public domain, but in addition to, thinking of creator ownership for characters, it's also things of like, what do you want this thing to actually look like? The format of the project itself. It's the equivalent of what kind of frame or lighting you want on a painting. For me, that format is a big part of the storytelling experience. And so it comes in right from the beginning. And, even if you're working with a traditional publisher, that is defined very clearly in the contract. Before, like for Hulk Grand Design, for example, before I started writing Hulk Grand Design, we defined how many pages I had and how big those pages were. So, I think making zines, kind of the same thing. And depending on the zine format, maybe you have some flexibility to add some pages if your idea goes a little bit longer. But for the most part, like I think about that stuff, it comes along with the story development.
You mentioned Octobriana being a blacklight comic. And I thought that was such a unique, spin on a traditional comic book. And I don't think that's something that maybe a big publisher, had you gone through a major publisher or someone that would have retained those rights, maybe would have taken the risk to do. But, the fact that, you were able to do that is really impressive in that format.
Yeah. And again, I think it comes down to just being one person. In my case, working with a publisher that I often say is like my biggest creative collaborator. But it's such a small number of people, so we get to control all of that. We're talking to different printers about it. We're kind of running over our ideas with them and whether they think it will work based on their printing background. As you get into a bigger publishing model, it's almost like layers of people who have their own specialty, right? So the editors don't necessarily talk to the printers. You have people who are production people. And again, they're not always communicating with one another and rarely with the creatives. So that's part of the intimacy of doing something yourself, which in most cases zines are. There's a lot of creative freedom in doing that yourself.
And on the topic of media being used, you mentioned printer, you mentioned, black light. Do you have a preference when it comes to what type of media you use, whether it's digital or print, or a favorite like media to kind of go to or use?
No, I don't. And I was just talking to somebody who teaches at the sequential art workshop about this and how students will come in and they'll have the tools they want to use, or they'll say it's all digital or it's all on paper, or, they have these rules. I don't have that. I've done comics that are completely drawn digitally on my iPad, and I've done comics and zines that are done with no digital component whatsoever. I did a zine probably 5 or 6 years ago, and it was celebrating a Pittsburgh artist, Bill Boychel, who was made posters in the 80s. And so I got hold of a bunch of his archives and I wanted to celebrate his work. And all of his work was created pre-digital. And so that was my challenge for the zine. Was I went to Kinko's one night and I decided I was going to make the entire zine with no computer component. So it was just cutting and pasting and taping things together and photocopying them. And there's something, to me, it's like, they're just tools, like you have an idea and then it's whatever tool you have access to, that's the one to use.
Where would you say you find the most, I guess, source of inspiration? Does it come from other comics or movies, books, any music?
I don't know where ideas come from. I consume so much stuff, even unintentionally, just scrolling through Instagram or something, you see thousands of these images that you don't have a lot of control over. So I don't know exactly where things come from. I love movies. I think a lot of comics makers grow up loving movies. It's a visual medium. Television, of course, everybody I think is into now. I read. So I don't know. It's a little bit of everything.
I've seen a lot of, does anyone have Street Angel right here? There's a lot of hands. So just using Street Angel as an example, do you remember where you were at when the idea of Street Angel came to mind?
Yes, I do. Street Angel started out, it was created in the early 2000s. I would rapidly read comics, and then I would get bored of them after like a couple of years of, say, reading Marvel comics. And at that point, Image started, and I read that for a couple of years, and then, kind of read through a cycle and got bored of those. So in the early 2000s, I was at my comic book shop, and it felt like everything was either like The Punisher, Batman, Spider-Man, or it was bad girls. There was like a subgenre of bad girl comics that were popular, like Lady Death and Elektra and characters like this. And that was all that I saw on the wall. And I had read those and I wasn't interested in them anymore. And so Street Angel developed as the opposite of like all the comics that I was seeing on New Comic Book Day. And this meant not a 12-year-old boy's power fantasy, not some half-naked woman. It was just kind of like this list of what I saw. And then the opposite was Street Angel. And at first it was going to be this like really mean-spirited parody of, some alternative. And after a couple of days of the kind of the mean spirit part, that falls away because it takes a long time to make a comic. And I didn't want to sit there angry for months on end. And it became really what Street Angel is today, which is an action comic, like a superhero, but not a superhero that anybody reading it would want to trade places with. Street Angel is a homeless orphan. So right away, it's not necessarily something you're fantasizing about if you're going to read this. Her life is very difficult, but she's a very good fighter and mostly fights for people who can't fight for themselves. In addition to that, I hope that anyone who reads Street Angel finds some humor in the stories because they are playing on the tropes of superhero comics. And I think there's room for humor there. One of her early villains is Dr. Pangea, who wants to re-Pangeify the Earth. Kind of, the idea of the supervillain taking over the world, but some funny twists in there, hopefully. So, it evolved a little bit away from that initial idea, but it retained that core of I wanted to do a comic that looked different than what I was seeing on the New Comic Day wall.
Stuff. And if anyone's curious about picking up Street Angel, Ben over here in the corners got a whole stack of them. So earlier you had mentioned that in the beginning, much like a lot of us here, maybe starting out early reading comic books, it was Marvel, it was dreams of drawing, Wolverine and Hulk. But you're someone that could actually say you've done that. You got to achieve your dream. Because, just recently, was it this year? Yeah, I think this year, Hulk Grand Design came out. And, we've talked a lot about the creative freedom that comes with zines and DIY and self-publishing, creator-owned work. But how are you able to, I guess, maintain your vision and in your integrity and bring your own style into, the house of ideas? We're talking about Hulk, a character that, has been around, for years, right? 60 years, I think, 60 years. So how are you able to bring something fresh to a character that's been around so long and has got, like you said, so many layers of red tape and editorial?
Marvel has done 3 Grand Design books. They did X-Men and Fantastic Four before they did Hulk. And both of those books were done by fellow Pittsburgh cartoonists, Ed Piskor and Tom Scioli. And these are cartoonists that do everything themselves. They write, they draw, they color, they letter. And I'm the same way. And so by the time I got to Hulk, Marvel already had kind of a model in place for Grand Design. And I talked to my editors a lot, along the way throughout the process. But early on, I would send them pages with kind of not sure what to expect from them. If I was going to get a lot of editorial feedback, if I was going to have to change my process to accommodate them. And my editor kind of explained to me that he recognized I work differently than the traditional Marvel comic, which is there's a writer and then that goes to the script goes to the editor and the editor looks at it and maybe edits it and then sends it to a penciler. And it keeps kind of going back and forth from each person through editorial back to the next person in the team. But they recognized that these Grand Design books were different. It was going to be the work of one cartoonist, and my process was different than their process and gave me basically freedom. And so that was awesome. I still had deadlines, and I would continue to send in pages so that they could see like what was important. I think from their standpoint is I didn't go way off the rails. And then the other thing is that the book was being turned in on time for their printing schedules and whatnot. And that was basically it. As long as I was hitting my deadlines, mostly they would see pages and say, good, keep going, that kind of thing, and gave me pretty much, I wouldn't say carte blanche because I'm working with Hulk and I'm working with his 60-year history. But within those bounds, like they were pretty free. You know, I have pages in there that I drew with ballpoint pens on notebook paper. And, you know, I think I actually got a nice email that day that I turned that one in. So they were very encouraging, but they were also very hands off in terms of the creative. And who knows, maybe if I had done something, you know, turn the Hulk purple or something, I might have heard from them about it. But as it was, you know, I think we had the same goal in mind and we're pretty clear from the beginning and had good communication, which I think is always helpful in any kind of collaboration.
That's good to hear. They were like, look, Hulk is 3 colors, gray, green, and red. That's it, buddy.
That's it.
You know, we're here celebrating DIY self-publishing. So safe to assume we are in a, you know, giant room filled with aspiring comic creators, artists, writers, et cetera, et cetera. What are some words and maybe advice for those aspiring and current comic creators that you would give based on something that you wish you would have received early on, you know, as you were breaking into the industry? And if you don't mind giving this in a twofold, maybe something introductory and something a little more advanced, considering we do have people out here, you know, selling their books.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is write. I think it's really important for any creative medium that you write as much of your own material as you can, because what you want to do is develop your voice. You know, the thing that separates any of these books, and really the books that stick with me and that I walk around and look for, it's a unique voice. You know, that's the thing that makes your work special. And I think writing is the easiest way to really hone that voice and figure out who you are and how you view the world. And so, you know, write, and write more and find as many people to read that and give you feedback as possible, but make it even a daily practice, writing, because depending on, you know, I got into this because I like to draw, and writing is something that I still have a hard time with. So the more you make that a regular part of your practice, the more natural that will become. So that would be my advice to everybody, whatever level you're at, is write your own material, because who knows you better than you? And that's really what you want to do is hone that voice. You know, that voice is yours and yours alone. And that's really the competitive advantage that you have. You know, in terms of maybe if you're a little further along, is educate yourself as much as you can. I mean, information is out there now in terms of what contracts look like, what various publishers' practices are. And you come to an event like this, you can talk shop with your neighbors and with the other creators. So if there's somebody that's doing what you want to do, often you can talk to them about their experience and take away, you know, what you can apply to your own goals and your own situation. You know, publishers are not always your best friends. So you want to do your homework before you sign anything like that.
One little bonus question to that. For anyone that watches Cartoonist Kayfabe, they know that the marching orders at the end of every episode and video is read more comics. I wanted to know if you would mind giving some of our folks here some fun homework, all right? Some fun homework. And what are some comics or books about comic making or just comics in general that you would recommend people, you know, check out if they were interested in getting into the industry and self-publishing?
Oh, man. All right. So one book that is either out now or coming out very soon is a soft cover collection of Dan Clow's 8-Ball. And this is not an obvious how-to book. However, there are some hidden gems within the pages that really talk about the comics industry. One is a storyline called Poussey, about a comic book artist who goes through kind of every type of comics in his profession, from mainstream superheroes to alternative comics. There's also a tract in there about, I think it's called Modern Cartoonist, and it's kind of a half parody and half absolutely sincere portrait of the comics industry and the comics art form. So in addition to that, it's a lot of great cartooning, and I know your library will have that on its shelves soon if it doesn't already. So I would highly recommend that 8-Ball collection. It's a master cartoonist that has come through a lot of development in the comics industry in his time making that comic. So I would recommend that one highly. Dave Gibbons, and forgive me for not knowing the answer to the title of this book, but Dave Gibbons, the artist on Watchmen, put out a comic on how to make comics. And it's very detailed because in addition to being an artist, he's also written a lot of comics. He letters comics, he colors comics. So he gives you kind of a full view of what it takes to make comics and his kind of practical learned advice on what he does and what he recommends. And I apologize for not having the name of that book off the top of my head. But if you look for Dave Gibbons' How To Comics book, I'm sure you will find it with no problem.
It's good stuff. All right, folks, let's go and give Jim Rugg a round of applause, right? All right, so in the interest of time, let's go ahead and open up this conversation with some questions from the audience. There's some really good ones in here. So the first question I've got is, did you ever have a disappointing title or publication, and how did you get over it? Basically, how should new artists / zine writers approach disappointing, whether it's in sales, attendance, etc.?
Yeah, I've had my share of disappointments. You just kind of gotta let it go. Move on to the next event. If it's something that you can identify, whatever the source of the disappointment is, you may be able to correct it moving forward. But there are also events that maybe aren't well attended, or I hate to say, maybe it's not your audience, but these things happen too. And sometimes the best thing is to stay the course and not get too discouraged. Maybe don't get too high or too low, regardless of how the event goes, because there's always tomorrow, good or bad. You're going to keep moving forward with this stuff. So that would be one thing. And, also make lemonade out of lemons. You come to an event like today, and if your sales aren't what you want them to do, maybe do a little bit more of walking around and meeting some fellow cartoonists and getting to know some of your peers, because that will always pay dividends. Just being able to talk to other people that have been through these experiences and realizing you don't suck because you had a bad day. Like everybody in this room can tell you a story about a bad experience at a convention, or a comic that didn't print right from the printer, or, whatever the case may be that you're struggling with. I promise you're not the only one who has had that experience. So depending on the situation, try to get something out of that. Go talk to some people, make some new friends. It'll serve you well overall. It's nice to be able to talk to other cartoonists and learn that you're not the only one that's had that experience.
Absolutely. Lean into your community. All right. So this next one here is a question about, your comic process. They ask, you're going to draw a comic. When you receive a script, would you prefer that the writer provide ideas for layout, or would you rather have that left completely up to you?
I would rather have it left up to me. I think that the thing that I'm best at when it comes to making comics is breaking down the story into visuals on a page. I think the common way that comics are written nowadays is called full script, and that is usually each panel is described in great detail. And to me, that feels like you're no longer the cartoonist. Now you're an illustrator. I like the cartooning part. There are a lot of great illustrators in comics, and clearly that method works for a lot of people. But I personally want to take that story and I want to adapt it to comics myself. I have a writing partner for some of my work named Brian Maruka. He's my writing partner on Street Angel, Aphrodisiac, a few other titles. And we actually write prose, like short stories. And then once we have that in a state that we like it, that we feel like this is a good story, it's ready to go, then I take it and adapt it to a comic, because that's the part I like. I like the storytelling in the comics form. So give me the story and let me break it down on the page.
I'm going to piggyback off this question. Who are some of your favorite comic book writers? Well, maybe writers in comic books, or just like short stories. Do you have any that you look up to or really inspire you?
That's a good question. I go through phases. One of the first people that I really followed was Frank Miller as a comic book writer. I mentioned Dan Clowes already, who I think is a really good writer. He's written screenplays and things in addition to comics to demonstrate kind of that quality. I loved Stephen King growing up, and I actually think I like his short stories better than his novels. So for short story form, that's somebody who I enjoy. And screenplays, I went through phases of reading screenplays, which maybe fall somewhere in between short stories and longer form.
Solid lineup. All right. This next question is obviously from a big fan of yours, because it gets into the weeds. What prompted your creation of Rambo 3.5? Was it a love of political satire? Was it a love of action comedies? Or did you just want to draw Bush and Stallone broing out?
So I do love action movies. You know, I grew up in kind of the middle of nowhere, and video stores were like one of my first great escapes. And that meant a lot of action movies and maybe B movies, and not always the best. So Rambo was a favorite. And in Rambo 3, he teams up with these Afghan freedom fighters who basically went on to become the Taliban. And so after the events of 9/11, they made a Rambo 4, and it was never addressed. And so I felt like if you wanted to continue enjoying the Rambo series, we needed to come to terms with this. And so I made Rambo 3.5 to kind of like fill that in and let all the Rambo fans continue to enjoy Rambo.
You almost made our signer laugh too. He's holding back tears of laughter. All right, let's continue to get meta. All right. What is the story behind the hawk in the photo? And I'm assuming it's the lit chat photo that they were sharing with you holding a hawk, looking like Ghostface Killer.
My wife and I went to Ireland for our 20th anniversary this year, and one of the things we did there was a hawk walk, and so that was my hawk on my walk, and he was awesome. So we got a couple of good photos, and I had to use them.
What was his name?
I don't remember his name. He didn't talk much.
Oh, I can imagine. Let's call him Rambo for the story going forward. Well, I guess on the topic of traveling, international like comic book scene wise, is there a country or maybe an international comic convention that you went to, or maybe shop that like really impressed you, like that's still kind of burned in your memory?
Yeah, I went to Tokyo. I think it was in 2017, and it was with like a school trip. And so during the day, we would do a lot of tourist kind of stuff. We had a guide that would show us different things, and it was beautiful. It was amazing. But then in the evenings, we were free, and we stayed in a district that was known as like the anime fan district. So there were Mario Karts running around this like neon landscape at night in cosplay. But there were like, I bought manga there off of street vendors. I bought it in used bookstores, in new bookstores, in like the white bright light manga shops right next to the subways that you hear like businessmen would buy their manga, and then get on the train, and then manga shops. And in this one district, it was loaded with manga. So like every night I would just be out in these shops, like looking at walls of genres that don't even exist here. Like baseball manga would be shelves of baseball manga and sports mangas. And I would find things like Otomo works that weren't translated into English. It'd be like a whole section of Otomo, the creator of Akira. And it was just whatever I had hoped of. If you've ever read the graphic novel Hicksville, it's sort of like this comics paradise. That's what I found there. I would go to these manga shops, and like the school kids would get out of school, and you would see busloads of kids running into the manga shops. It was just like this fantasy land where there were comics for every demographic you can imagine. The manga shops would be 6 or 7 stories tall. There'd be like one floor that was all doujinshi, which was like amateur press. Some of it's fan art. There would be galleries within there. There would be like, adult manga would be like one floor. It was just this comics paradise is the only way I can think of to describe it. And, I've done Angoulême in France, the famous French comics festival. And it's another amazing comics area where like an entire city is just there celebrating comics. And it's very international in scope. So you have creators from all over the world, and that kind of, love of comics, reverence for comics has had, I still think about that all the time. And it's incredible to me. Wherever we travel, I always find comic shops, and it has that kind of like, you can almost see the love on the shelves no matter where it's at.
That's awesome. I know what I'm doing tonight. Expedia, here I come. All right, this next, we're getting into some comic industry talk. I love a good comic industry topic. All right, this question. Do you feel the proliferation of variant covers is beneficial to the long-term health of comics?
Okay, that's a really inside baseball kind of question. I think that certain stores have found ways to leverage that to their advantage, and anything that stores can do to keep the lights on, I think is beneficial to comics. I don't know about a blanket statement of whether they're positive or negative overall. They relate to, in the early 90s, I think, is when variant comics started to pop up. And the early 90s were followed by a time of collapse in the American comics industry. So there are a lot of things we point at and blame for that. Mainly that early 90s was a speculator era. So people would buy these variant covers with the idea of like, this is going to be worth a lot of money, or I need to buy 10 copies of this new comic because I want all the variants. I don't know that that's a healthy thing, but I also don't know that it's a big percentage of comics readers or buyers that engage in that. So depending on how the variants run, I think depends whether they're good or bad. As long as you can read those comics without having to engage in inflated prices, I think no harm, no foul. But I know a lot of people don't feel that way. So, and I don't run a comic book shop. So I may not be the best person to ask about it because I really don't know the mechanics of that very well.
That's an honest answer, and I appreciate that. Whoever did ask that, we do got Ben over here. I think he'd gladly take that answer.
I was seeing if Ben was shaking his fist at me with that
Ben was
response.
Like, Jim, I will. Ben was like, Jim, I swear I brought all these books for you. Don't betray me. All right, next question. Oh, this is a good one. Okay, going to Cartoonist Kayfabe. We're going to switch it up a little bit. How do you and Ed land your shoot interviews? And will we see interviews of Garth Ennis in the future? Also, thanks so much for visiting Jax. Joe.
Well, we don't have Garth Ennis on the schedule, but we're both fans. So, Garth, if you're watching this, you have an open invitation to Cartoonist Kayfabe. We get interviews a variety of ways. Like we've both been making comics for 20 years and going to these shows. And so we know a lot of other comic book makers. Sometimes we just blindly reach out to people, and sometimes we'll have maybe a third party, a friend of a friend kind of thing. And we've done all of those things. We've even been approached by a few of the people that we've interviewed, which is kind of mind blowing as a comics fan that I am. So there's no one way that we get guests to be on there. It's something of, coincidence a lot of times, or if they have a new book out, people want to sell their books. And so that's always a good time to kind of like reach out and be like, hey, you've got a, a new collection of 8-Ball. Maybe you want to come on the show and talk about it, for instance.
Yeah, you got to get them when they're at their highest shameless plug mode. Well, have you had a few interviews where you've absolutely like either geeked out or you had to hold in your fanboy?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Cartoonist Kayfabe in a lot of ways is really just the ultimate, we always say like, I'm the first kayfabe effect victim. So, the people that we interview, these are my heroes, many of them, people that I've been reading since I was a kid before I was making comics. So there are a lot of those moments. And, a couple of standouts. We talked to Dave Gibbons for New Year's this past year and went page by page through Watchmen number 12. And we had been doing one issue of Watchmen each month last year. So to get to the final issue and to have Dave Gibbons go through 2 hours of his time and really talk to us about this and show us script excerpts, that one blew my mind. But honestly, I could probably name 20 of these experiences like that. If you've never seen our interview with Sergio Aragones and you want to feel great and have your heart grow several sizes, like I came away from that interview just maybe the most inspired I've ever felt. Just a beautiful man and really opened up to us. It's not someone I had a previous relationship with, but an extraordinary person. And so, yeah, these interviews, they're very different from person to person, but they do have, they often take me by surprise. So
I'm going to add this question here because it's very similar, and it's from my man Jason over here. And he actually brought up, he wrote that he thought the Sergio Aragones interview was especially touching. You kind of answered about the ones that kind of surprised or that you were happy to get, but were there any surprise interviews that maybe you didn't think that you were going to get, or it was outside the realm of possibility that, you made a reality?
Mark Miller was somebody that surprised me because Mark Miller is a little more of a mainstream. We do a lot of like alternative comics and a lot of writer artists, like one person doing everything. And we interviewed Mark Miller, the writer of, Kick-Ass and Wanted, and I'm probably forgetting a whole bunch of stuff, but a huge writer who comes out of Marvel and then went into creator-owned works. And I had a great time with that interview and wasn't sure what to expect because we didn't talk to a lot of writers up to that point. And so that one stood out as being kind of a surprise and a very pleasant surprise.
I think two that come to mind were, really anytime that you guys interview any of the Image founding fathers like Todd McFarlane or Rob Liefeld, just to see the boyish exuberance from you, and especially Ed Piscor, right? Like to see him like smiling and like, to get read and whatnot is always really awesome to see. And last question that we've got is, what graphic novel have you reread more often than any other, and why?
Probably Ghost World, and that's by Dan Clowes. For a long time, he's been my favorite cartoonist, and I've reread it because I have it in different formats. So often, if I had it in the original 8-ball issues, it was serialized, so I read it then, and then I probably read it again before it was even collected, because it's like, okay, now I have a stack of the issues, I'm going to read it all. And then as editions would come out or I would get them, I would read it. I've done other podcasts about it, I've been on podcasts where like we pick a book and then we'll all talk about that book. So probably Ghost World, unless I'm forgetting something obvious, but possibly Electra Assassin. That's another one that I really love. And I've been reading it now for, 30 years. It came out in 86 and I did not understand it the first time I read it. It's Bill Sienkiewicz does this painted artwork and Frank Miller does a script that sort of doesn't give anything away. It's not the old Stan Lee style where like the caption describes what the drawing is. And so the first time I read it, I had no idea what was going on. But over the years, I've really come to enjoy that one. So possibly Electra Assassin.
That's good stuff. And speaking of Frank Miller, you guys had Frank Miller on Cartoonist Kayfabe, correct?
Come on, Frank. What are you waiting for?
Come on, Frank. All right. Well, Jim, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so ecstatic that you got to come down here in Jackson, experience DCAZ in person. But I think that is the end of our time. And I just want to say thanks again.
Thank you.
And a big shout out to all of you as well for the questions. All right.
Thanks, everyone.